Thank you. I'm not only an expert on this, I'm just a tourist, a passerby. I went to the gallery, saw the program, and came to listen to some of the speakers. And I have a question to the last speaker. So you mean that these icons and church paintings are sometimes taken from these religious institutions and put into museums. So they stop being sacred objects when this happens? This is my first question. And then, does it ever happen that these paintings are believed so important for religious, for people, for faith, that they are put back into the church, as it, for example, happened in Russia 2 years ago, when one of the, it's called a very famous painting, Trinity, from the 15th century, that was in the museum after the Bolshevik Revolution for almost 100 years. And now with desecularization of Russia, church brought it back, and there's an uproar by art historians because they believe it's going to be destroyed. So does something like this happen? Are these paintings sometimes returned into churches? Thank you.
Thank you. Can you stand up and mic? Thank you.
So regarding the first question, these paintings, as I mentioned, were conceptualized to be displayed side by side, other paintings and sculptures in the altarpiece, and engaged in the context of the church space. They had very specific functions. When the gallery is being put together, select paintings, Koto didn't pull all the paintings down from an altarpiece, he would select one or two, and these would get pulled out of the altarpiece and then installed in the gallery. They were not meant to be seen as individual works of art, because it disrupts the narrative, which is why I refer to them as fragments. And I always tell my students, if you go to an exhibition and see historical paintings like Caravaggio or something, they're fragments because they weren't intended to be seen brightly lit, hanging by themselves as individual works. The space of the gallery is not about liturgical practice or ceremony or ritual. It has its own rituals, but they're different. And they're in the service of creating or generating some concept of a distinct school of art that's related to their location of production, i.e. Mexico, the National School of Art. They're no longer religious works. I mean, they are on some level. This change doesn't erase completely their previous religious or holy significance, but it layers over it new signifying potentials that are determined by the space and their new reading that's motivated as works of national art by national artists. And in terms of works being returned, as I was saying a little while ago, there were certain paintings Goto wanted to get his hands on, and he was denied. And these paintings that he was denied were considered of special cult significance. And some churches were like, no, there's no way. This is a holy image. Yeah, we're not going to give it to you. And he just had to deal with it and move on to the next church. So the really important works that were clearly of cult significance to the larger public were not touched. And as I mentioned, those images that were considered either a chiropoietic, there are a couple, the Virgin of Guadalupe is the main one, but there are others he didn't include because he's talking about works made by national masters, things that were made by humans. And if these works are chiropoietic of divine origin, it's not going to function. But these men are Catholic too. They're not going to go against their faith. So none of the works in the gallery were works that had to be returned. They were works that were voluntarily relinquished. Yeah.
Okay, she's asking about the paintings by Villalpando that are in Guadalupe, Zacatecas.
The paintings that are in the show, we don't have exact patronage documents, or at least I haven't been able to uncover them to pinpoint their exact history of provenance, but based on the evidence that we do have, the Villalpando painting of Sor Maria de Agreda, for example, we are presuming that it was commissioned by the Propaganda Fide in Zacatecas. So yes, we do have a general sense, an idea of who commissioned it, where it would have been displayed, who would have been viewing it at the time.
Complicated subject.
In Goto's text, as I mentioned, there are three characters walking through the gallery that's being reinstalled. And as they're walking, they talk about the paintings they see, and there are deictic markers in there. Like, this painting before us, this painting we see. But because it's a text and existing in an ideational space, he is able to make reference to works that are still in situ. You know, he has a very small collection and it's incomplete. So he fleshes it out by combining works that are not in the gallery with the works in the gallery. Like he'll say, the work that we see before us, blah, blah, blah. And it makes me think of this work by Cristóbal de Villalpando in this church, that church. So if you look at Coto's dialogue, because there are several Villalpando works that he collects, he identifies. If they're not in the gallery, he'll identify where they're from. So that should be a useful source to try to trace where some of these paintings came from.
Yeah, that is useful. Another question? Andrew?
Yeah, it is a really naive question to a bunch of art historians. So I like your quote, Ray, from the infinite to the finite. You know, taking these things which have this infinite value or spiritual value and reducing them or taking them out into a more secular space. I mean, how do you guys think of these religious arts in this world now?
Does someone have,
I'll take up the question simply because I still work in active religious spaces. I carry out my fieldwork in churches and monasteries, and even though the monasteries have been secularized, they're still important religious spaces to these communities. And I think I just kind of want to pick up on what Ray was saying, is that if we look around and we pay attention to how people are interacting with these artworks, we learn so much about what they mean for their own communities, right? And so Ray gave this wonderful anecdote about seeing a man crossing himself in front of an image of the Virgin. You know, I've seen things that are absolutely extraordinary, both inside churches, inside monasteries, and also inside places where those paintings have been taken and now are being displayed. And I think one of the, most amazing things about being a colonial art historian is that we're working with living communities and living traditions. And what we're trying to do in our work, in many cases, is to build that bridge between actors in the past, right, and their descendants today, and how they're using these artworks to negotiate these changes that are happening over time. But what's really interesting is they're happening through the way that they're interacting with these artworks, right? These artworks might be in a new context, and they might have meanings that are being kind of layered on top of them as a palimpsest, but it's still the object itself, right, through which these communities are negotiating these like fundamental shifts and changes. And I think that that's so fascinating, and like one of the gifts that art historians of colonial art, give other people working in other fields and other times and moments.
Do you think your perspective on that is shaped? It seems to me your perspective on that might be shaped by the fact that you work on places.
Yeah, totally.
Right? And so for folks who might be working on books who were printed one place and circulated widely, or paintings that appear in a sort of like, oh, and now this is at auction, and do we know how it got at auction? Well, no, actually. And so the line between object, place, community, I think you sit in one side of a spectrum, and then on the other side of the spectrum is this tattered relationship between past and present that requires more careful sleuthing, or prohibits a certain kind of way of working, or poses challenges to accessing. And I think we might think about this kind of spectrum of, like, for example, the statue that I work on the most is in a cloistered convent in a suburb of Mexico City. This is not the kind of thing that one pays an entrance fee for and goes and stands and looks at as an artwork, right? And so you ring the doorbell and speak to the person who then lets you through, and this shaped the way that I thought about it, but also the kind of access that I had to it as an art historian, the kinds of questions I could ask, the kinds of analyses I could carry out. And so this question of placid objects that have this rich kind of a more concrete connection, and then on the other hand, these objects for whom that connection might be more tattered. And I think how we work across that spectrum, I suppose what I'm thinking is that we might want to be annoying and provide very concrete answers to different artworks along that spectrum that might have differing, that might make us feel differently about, yes, this artwork we think this way, this artwork we feel differently, right? I don't know.
I have a similar relationship, right? Because I do work with sites and I work with miraculous images that are still devotional images and obviously have huge followings. And sometimes accessibility is an issue. You go when the sanctuary is open, you take pictures till they tell you to stop. You know, plead, you beg, you take your mom with you, and hopefully that works, right? And so, you know, sometimes you genuflect or perhaps become very Catholic at those moments where you need to have some access. But it's difficult when there is a following, yet it's enlightening. I agree. It is part of the story. It is why these things matter, and it is palpable when you see it before you. Suddenly, you know, you get the colonial period and you get that culture of devotion because it's right before your eyes still. With the pilgrimages, with the touching, with the petitions and all the rest, the ex-votos, etc. So I think it's, you know, depending on the day, sometimes it's an issue, but usually it's wonderful, actually, to witness and to see these places that are still alive in that devotional setting.
It was sort of a looping back to what you were saying, thinking of it in light of what Ray was saying, with Quoto being tasked with creating a national gallery with no money. And I thought, wow, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And that got me thinking, well, what, you know, of the objects that he was able to acquire and that he used to comprise that gallery, and thinking, well, what was included? How does that shape how we understand what colonial art is from Mexico? Is it representative? Is it not? But then through this conversation, realizing that those what ends up being in that gallery, therefore, are things that people really had contact with when they're in these public spaces, well, when they're in church spaces, which are effectively public to most people at that time. So it ends up being very representative, in spite of having no budget, in spite of looking only to certain types of sources to create a national body of artwork. It is the art that people have contact with and that they see when they're in a church or in some other sort of public space of that nature. So anyway, it comes back to itself is what I suppose I was reflecting upon.
Other last thoughts, questions? If not, I think we will conclude our day. Thank you so much. I especially want to thank those who have been here since the morning, since 9:30. You're our heroes, and thank you for supporting our work and for staying engaged. And thank you to our speakers and to Mark White.